as you'd call it, and it hadn't quite gone away yet. So I'm not leering at you. I'm just favoring one side. It's always nice when you can go and have fellowship with Christian people. Several years ago, I was able to lead a fellow to Christ in Tampa who has the same job I do with my company. And then a few weeks later, we took he and his wife to a banquet in Tampa where Theo McCulley was speaking. Now, Mr. McCulley was the father of one of the 5 young men who were slain by the Alka Indians back in the 50s. And she came to Christ that night. And this couple have really gone on for the Lord. And so they were on the trip with us. They roomed right next to us in the Kensington Hilton Hotel in London, and we had seats right together on the plane, and their teenage daughter roomed with our daughter. So we had real good Christian fellowship, the whole trip. And then we met so many fine Christians over there. I happen to know Dave Adams, who heads up the work for Trans World Radio in the British Isles. He married an Alabama girl who went to school with my older son. And so we went to church on Sunday night with them. And some of you may know the pastor at the church. He's quite an author. His name is John Stott, S-T-O-T-T. And we were at his church on Sunday night. And it's very interesting. Now, it's an Anglican church, and this particular church is 150 years old, right in the center of London, right in the downtown section of London. And in London, I suppose there must be 45 or 50 or more Anglican churches. And there's about 3 of them that have real fundamental pastors. Now, these 3 are just absolutely packed out. You couldn't get another person in there. This big church that we were in has 2 balconies, and it must have been 800 or 900 people there, and this was a Sunday evening service. Of course, the other Anglican churches, they don't even have Sunday evening services, most of them. And so it seems like somebody would get the point that people are hungry for the Word. But this huge church on a Sunday evening was just packed out with people. And of course, Stott really puts out the Word of God. It was a wonderful spiritual time, and we enjoyed being there with Dave and Wanda Adams. Then we had I happen to know Glenn Fogel. Now, Glenn also went to college with my older son at Tennessee Temple, and he works among the English-speaking diplomats in London, not the English people themselves, because they would kind of resent an American over there, you might say, evangelizing them. But he works with other embassy people. For instance, I was at a little breakfast where there was the Lebanese there, and there was this man that had just come back from Russia. He works with a group that's kind of headed up by this senator from Iowa, Senator Hughes. Any of you know him? And they're trying to win people in the higher political echelons to Christ. So Glenn Fogel took us all day Wednesday, all around the western part of London and Windsor Castle and all of that. So we had a wonderful time with them all day Wednesday. Then on Friday noon, just before we left, we had lunch with Gary Singleton and his wife. Now, Gary's a Lakeland boy who was a roommate of my son in college. Seems like all of his Christian friends went over to London to minister, or that area. And he works with college students in area out east of London for a while, ways. And then we were able to visit with Ted Hubbard. Now, Ted is the head of the Christian Businessmen's Committee for the whole of the British Isles. And he's a lawyer there in London area in a town named Bromley, just south of London. And he's a solicitor, I guess, is what you call them over there. You have solicitors and barristers, and he's on the solicitor end of it. Anyway, he's a member of the National Trust. Now, that's an organization of prominent people who buy up national shrines, and he had helped a group obtain Churchill's home back soon after the war when Churchill was still living there. And so as soon as Churchill died in 1964, the National Trust took over his home, and we were able to go there and have a personal tour by a member of the National Trust, which was very interesting. He's a fine Christian man. And that night we went to his home, and he has a Bible study with a group of teenage girls. He has 4 daughters, and they bring in their friends, and just a terrific Christian man. And they were showing us all of their graduates. They've had these classes for teenage girls for quite a number of years. He and his wife had. But I suppose the main highlight for us was we were able to visit with Lorna's niece. You may remember that Lorna Young brought her niece from London here to the Bible study about 18 months ago, and when we gave a little invitation, her niece Valerie raised her hand, and then I believe through Lorna's encouragement she professed to receive the Lord, and we were very anxious, to see how she was coming along, and she's just coming along real well. She's not found just the Christian fellowship she would like to, and a church that she would feel free in, but she really does appreciate her salvation. And we had her to dinner out at the hotel on Monday evening, and then she took all day Thursday off and toured us all over in the Kent area, and took us to Canterbury and some of the other places around there. So we were with her all day Thursday. Now I want to ask you to do something for me. She and her mother, that would be Lorna's older sister, are coming to Sebring on the 24th of this month. And now they treated me like I was a king. And I want you to treat them like they're queens when they come. If you would do that for me, I'd really appreciate it, because Valerie is a brilliant girl. She's a secretary for the publisher of the Financial Times, which is kind of the Wall Street Journal of that area, and she's just as sharp as she can be. I mean, she's got everything right on her fingertips, and you're going to miss a treat if you don't spend some time visiting with her, because she loves to talk about the things of the Lord now since she's come to know the Lord, and she can teach you a lot. I'll tell you, she knows more than I do about a lot of things, and not that that's so much. But we certainly did enjoy that time with Valerie, and we met some other of Lorna's relatives in Canterbury and so forth. So when they come, you have them over for dinner or something like that, if you will. Anyway, we just had a great time, and we had terrific fellowship with a lot of fine Christians, both English and Americans that are over there. I don't know if those people would quite go along with Doc's statement that we went over to the continent, though. I think the continent's across the channel over there. But we had a good time, and we had excellent weather for a trip like that. Well, that's enough for that part of it, but I just wanted to share it with you. Then I wanted to remind you that on the first Monday night of June, that I'll be bringing a team here from Argentina. Joe Jordan will be bringing the Bible lesson, and he's a great Bible teacher. He heads up the Word of Life work in Argentina, and he's going to bring 2 Argentine couples with him. They're newlyweds, both, and they've come to Christ through the ministry down there, and they're a musical group, so they'll be singing for you, and you just ought to just go out and bring a lot of people here, because it's going to be a most enjoyable time. Or I wouldn't step down and if I didn't know that you'd appreciate them tremendously. Well, of course, I would be bringing the word myself, but get all your friends to come and see what's going on down there in Argentina. And it will be a good message from the Word, too. It won't just be a report. It'll be a Bible study. And that'll be the first Monday night in June. All right, now shall we turn to the book of Exodus, chapter 33. Exodus chapter 33. We're going to read a portion beginning with the 12th verse of Exodus 33. And Moses said unto the Lord, See, thou sayest unto me, Bring up this people, and thou hast not let me know whom thou wilt send with me. Yet thou hast said, I know thee by name, and thou hast also found grace in my sight. Now therefore I pray thee, if I have found grace in thy sight, show me now thy way, that I may know thee, and I may find grace in thy sight, and consider that this nation is thy people. And he said, that is, God said, My presence shall go with thee, and I will give thee rest. And he said unto him, If thy presence go not with me, carry us not up from here. For wherein shall it be known here that I and thy people have found grace in thy sight? It is not in that thou goest, is it not in that thou goest with us? So shall we be separated, I and thy people, from all the people that are upon the face of the earth. And the Lord said unto Moses, I will do this thing also that thou hast spoken, for thou hast found grace in my sight, and I know thee by name. And he said, I beseech thee, show me thy glory. And he said, I will make all my goodness pass before thee, and I will proclaim the name of the Lord before thee. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. And he said, Thou canst not see my face, for there shall no man see me and live. And the Lord said, Behold, there is a place by me, and thou shalt stand upon a rock. And it shall come to pass, while my glory passes by, that I will put thee in a cleft of the rock, and will cover thee with my hand while I pass by. And I will take away my hand, and thou shalt see my back, but my face shall not be seen. Now this is a conversation, of course, between Moses and his God Jehovah. Remember, when you see the Lord spelt with all caps, as you see it in this section here, it is God as he has to do with man. And here, God is having to do with the people of Israel. Now let's review a little bit. You remember in the early chapters of Exodus, God had redeemed his people Israel out of captivity in Egypt. And then he had led them down into the desert. Now, he told them that he was going to take them into a good land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the promised land that he had promised to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But he didn't take them directly into the land, although it would have only been a few days' journey. But instead he turned southward down into the desert where there was no sustenance for this 2 or 3 million people, plus all of their animals and so forth, and they had to depend upon God to sustain them. Now he sustained them with manna from heaven each morning, except on the Sabbath, and then he sustained them with water out of a rock as it was needed, or he would take them to an oasis. Anyway, he took care of them. And some 13 or 14 months after they had come out of Egypt, they settled for a while down at the base of this large mountain that's called Sinai in some places in the Old Testament, and it's called Horeb in other places. And there he told them they would need to camp, and God called Moses up into the top of this mountain. And as he called Moses up, he overshadowed the mountain with a huge cloud, with lightning and thundering and so forth, and he called Moses up into that cloud, which represented his presence, and he gave Moses the 10 Commandments, as we know them, and as they're recorded in the 20th chapter of Exodus. You know, you learn to recite them as a child in Sunday school. And then after God gave Moses these 10 Commandments, Moses came back down to the people and told them that if God was to be with them, they would need to live in this manner. And they said, well, we'll do all that God asked us to do. God, you let us know what to do, and that's what we'll do. And so God knew that his law would be higher than they could attain. And so he called Moses back up into the mountain and told Moses that he wanted to give him these 10 Commandments in writing, and also that he wanted to give the people a method of worship. Now, the writing, the Ten Commandments, were placed on 2 stone tablets. And we're told that God made the tablets. That is to say, He hewed out the stones and made the tablets, and then He wrote on the tablets Himself. He wrote on both sides of each stone tablet. And the commandments that had to do with man's relationship with God were written on one side of the tablet, and the commandments that had to do with man's relationship with man were written on the other side. Some feel that there were 4 on one and 6 on the other. Others say, no, the 5th commandment has more to do with our relationship with God than it does with man, and they were 5 and 5. I don't know for sure, but I think I rather favor the latter solution there. So these commandments were written on these stones. Now God knew that the people would not keep them. And so He gave Moses something else. He gave Moses a description of a very precise description of a tabernacle or a place of worship, which had these 7 pieces of furniture in it, each one representing something. And then He gave Moses a system of animal sacrifice. And He told Moses he would need to ordain priests from the family of Aaron and have a way of approach to God, because otherwise God would not be able to do business with and fellowship with a sinful man. Now, some people are under the impression that in the Old Testament you proved your righteousness by keeping the law, that is, the commandments of God. This is not so. God gave the law to show what His holy word was. But people in the Old Testament were not able to keep that law any more than people in this day and age would be able to keep it, or not even so much so, because they did not have the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit. So what God did was He furnished them with a system whereby they could have their sins covered until Christ would be crucified. And this involved animal sacrifice, or that is to say, the transferal of the sins of sinful man over to innocent animals. That's what the sacrifices all were about. And people gained entrance to God not by keeping the commandments in the Old Testament, but by accepting God's system of animal sacrifice, as did Abel. And that's why Abel's sacrifice was acceptable to God and Cain's was not. It's because Abel came to God God's way. So the way a person was saved in the Old Testament was by availing himself of the system of animal sacrifice, which showed that he acknowledged his own sinfulness and his inability to keep God's law. And we do the same thing today. We come to God by acknowledging our inability to keep God's righteous law and transferring, so to speak, our sins to the spotless Lamb of God. All the animal sacrifices that were made before Christ hung on Calvary's cross were anticipatory. They looked forward to the time when Christ would pay for our sins. Now, never has the blood of bulls and goats or animals paid for man's sins. It was simply a system whereby man could acknowledge that he needed a perfect sacrifice and that he could not live up to God's law acceptably. So God gave this to Moses. At the same time, He gave them the Ten Commandments in writing, so that man would have a system to come to God, and God could have fellowship with him on the basis of the confession of the sin by the man placing his head on an innocent animal and thereby saying, I'm a sinner, and I understand that the wages of sin is death, and therefore I transfer my sins to this innocent animal, looking forward to the time when God will offer a perfect sacrifice. Now we find that after God had given Moses these very, very precise directions for building this tabernacle and the furniture thereof, after he'd done that, and after he'd given him these 2 stones with the Ten Commandments written on them, Moses came down, and the people were already sinning They were breaking the first two commandments. The first commandment was that you should have no other gods before God, and the other was that you would make no graven image. And they had done both of these things. Now, Moses was not taken by surprise because God told him before he ever left the top of the mountain, the cloud in the mountain, before he ever left there and came back down to where the people was, God said, look, the people have already broken the laws that they said they would keep. Now, they had a reason for doing this. Moses had been gone for 40 days, and they had their trust in Moses as a leader. They didn't have their trust in God. And God had to teach them to place His trust in God instead of the leader. They had seen Moses in the power of God perform all these miracles. They had seen Moses bring these 10 plagues upon the Egyptians. And they had seen Moses take his rod and open up the Red Sea. And they'd seen Moses bring the sea back together and drown all of the armies of Pharaoh. And they'd seen Moses turn the bitter water into sweet. And they'd seen Moses strike a rock and saw water coming out of it. And they had their faith in Moses. And when they decided Moses was gone, normal reasoning would say that a man couldn't live 40 days and 40 nights in a howling desert, in a terrible dry desert without food or water. We're told 2 times in Exodus and 2 times in Deuteronomy, and again in Stephen's sermon in the book of Acts, that he neither ate food nor drank water. Now, when Christ fasted for 40 days, the situation was a little different, and we're told there he ate no food, but it doesn't say he didn't drink any water. But Moses neither ate food nor drank water. This would have to be by the power of God. And so, what would you have thought if your leader had gone, and he'd been gone up in the top of a mountain? He didn't come down. They watched. They had Joshua, and they had the elders of Israel surrounding the mountain, waiting for Moses to come back down. And they would have known had he come back down. There was no water in that mountain, no source of food whatsoever. And how could a man still be living 40 days later? You see, they had not learned that the power was of God. And so what they did was, they decided that their protection had been by the gods of Egypt. They knew no other gods except the gods of Egypt. And one of the gods of Egypt was the cows. And so they figured, well, we better make an image to the gods of Egypt. And maybe they'll take care of us, since our leader's gone. And this was their reasoning, and this is why they had made a golden calf. Now, why does God put all this down in His book in such detail for us? Well, let's remember again that in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11, God says, all these things happened unto them for examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world is come. Now, what is God showing us here? Well, He's showing us several things. He's showing us, number one, that no matter how much we promise God we'll keep His commandments, we will not. You say, well, I would never make an image to a golden calf. Well, you see, when it's referred to us, this is symbolic. We put things before God when we think maybe God didn't quite hear our prayer. We lean on the arm of flesh all the time. We resort to human courts. We think in terms of who can do something for us, or who can get us in to certain places, or what politician can help us out with our problem, or who can we send to Tallahassee as a lobbyist to look out after our interest, and that type of thing. We do it all the time. We lean on an arm other than God, and any time you lean on any power other than God, you're putting something before God. And that's a violation of the first commandment. And as far as the golden calf is concerned, that's making a god out of something that isn't a god. And all of us, we find things that we actually regard higher than we do God. Some of us are sports fans or fanatics, probably, and we put that before God. Or some of us may be antique buffs, or whatever. And we spend more time. Now, we say, I don't put that before God, but we spend more time involved with some of those things, and more of our conversation, more of our thought process. Some of us, it's our jobs. Some of us, it's our families. Some of it's our homes. or what have you. Whatever occupies our energies and our thoughts more than God does is our golden calf. And we need to recognize the fact that we have those propensities. We're subject to that type of sin. We put things before our God, just exactly like they did. Jesus said the first and great commandment is, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and all thy soul and all thy mind. We don't do that. Anytime we love something or regard something or covet something or hold on to something, we're showing our lack of faith in the goodness of God, and we're putting something before Him. That's why we need a system of approach to God. And God has furnished that for us very graciously in the life, the death, and in the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ, who He sent from heaven's glory and who kept God's Word perfectly and who could honestly say at all times, I do always those things which please the Father. Not a single Christian sitting here or anyone else on the face of this earth has ever been able to say that truthfully. I do always those things which please the Father. But he could say that. And so our approach to God is in Christ, in the Beloved, because He kept the way to God. Now what God is doing here for the people of Israel, He's making a way of approach unto Himself, awaiting the time when Christ will come and dwell among us. And that's what all of this tabernacle is about and so forth. He took the children of Israel down into the wilderness that they might be tested to see if they would trust Him. The reason He left Moses up in the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, He did it on purpose. He took Moses up there for a longer period of time than a human being could naturally possibly live under those circumstances. And the logical conclusion, the reasoning conclusion, was that Moses was dead. And they needed someone to guide them. They needed a protector. And they had never had their faith in God. They had their faith in Moses. Now, Moses understood enough about God to know that He was a holy God. And so he felt like that unless he interceded for the people, that God would have nothing to do with the people. And he didn't want to be saddled with that many perverse sinners all on his own shoulders. And he said, God, listen, if you won't go with me, if you won't take these people upon yourself, well then I want to die. And he says, he had said back in chapter 32, he says, just blot out my name out of your book if you're going to abandon these people. He says you took them for your own people. And of course, this is exactly what God knew Moses would say. That's the reason He chose Moses to start with. And this is what He was waiting for Moses to say. Moses placed his whole trust in the Lord God. Now Moses says, God, you've said that I'm a special person. You see, God had called Moses His special friend. And He'd given Moses all of this direction. And Moses says, God, I want to know you better. I'll tell you what I'd like for you to do. You said I'm a special person. I'm a special friend of yours. I want to see you, God, in all of your glory. And God said, Moses, that's not possible. I have to veil my glory in your presence. Because if you were to see me in all of my glory, you would die. Notice again in Exodus chapter 33, verse 20. And He, that is God, said, Thou canst not see my face, for there shall no man see me and live. Now this seems rather strange when we realize back in chapter 11 that we're told that the Lord spoke, in verse 11 of chapter 33, and the Lord spoke unto Moses face to face, as a man speaketh unto his friend. And he turned again into the camp, but his servant Joshua the son of Nun, the young man, departed not out of the tabernacle. Now verse 11 and verse 20 would seem to be contradictory, wouldn't they? In verse 20, God says, you can't see my face, for no one shall see my face and live. In verse 11, it says, the Lord spoke unto Moses face to face. Well, what is the answer to that? This is not the first time that the Bible says that someone appeared, that God appeared unto someone. Turn back to the book of Genesis, and you'll see there in chapter 32 of Genesis an encounter that Jacob had with God, and we're told there that God was seen. See in Genesis 32:30, and Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. In other words, he was surprised. He says, I've seen God and I didn't die. And as he passed over Peniel, the sun rose upon him, and so forth. So, did Jacob there in Genesis 32, did he see God or didn't he? He said, I saw God. Now, the people knew that this was a law that if they would see God, if they ever saw God, they'd die. For instance, hold your place here in Exodus, and let's look over in a couple of accounts in the book of Judges. Now, Judges would be the 7th book in the Old Testament, comes right after Joshua. But you'll remember the encounter that Gideon had in the 6th chapter. Notice in Judges chapter 6, verse 22. And when Gideon perceived that he was an angel of the Lord, Gideon said, Alas, O Lord God, for I have seen an angel of the Lord face to face. And the Lord said unto him, Peace be unto thee, fear not, thou shalt not die. Now Gideon knew the Word of God, and he knew that God had told Moses that if he ever saw him face to face, that he'd die. And so Gideon says, I've seen him face to face, so I'll die. And God says, no, you'll not die. Then we have another account over in Judges 13. You remember? This is the episode of God appearing to the two parents, the mother and the father, of Samson, back before Samson was born, in Judges chapter 13. Verse 22, And Manoah said unto his wife, We shall surely die because we've seen God. He says, you know, God told Moses that nobody could see God and live. Now we've seen Him, and so we're going to die. And you know what his wife said? Well, she said something in verse 23. And his wife said unto him, If the Lord were pleased to kill us, He would not have received a burnt offering and a meat offering at our hands, neither would He have shown us all these things, nor as at this time have told us things like these. Now what had He told them? He had told them that they were going to have a child. Now she was barren, and the angel of the Lord came to her and says, You're going to have a child. And she says, Why, Manoah, what makes you say we're going to die? This same God that we've seen face to face just got through telling me I'm going to have a child, and I'm not even pregnant yet. So I'm not going to die for 9 months at least. And so I'm not afraid. Well, what is the answer here? Well, both of these are true. And we could be given some insight into what is meant in Exodus 33:11, where it says, the Lord spoke unto Moses face to face. Let's look at some commentary on that. Let's look back at Exodus 24. Exodus 24, verse 9. Then went up Moses and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and the 70 elders of Israel, and they saw the God of Israel. And there was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of sapphire stone, as it were the body of heaven in its clearness. Verse 11, And upon the nobles of the children of Israel he laid not his hand. Also they saw God, and did eat and drink. So we see all of these occasions where we're told that God was seen, and yet God tells Moses, you can't see me face to face, or you'll die. Well, there's some comment on this matter. For instance, in Deuteronomy, let me see if I can find it here now. Let's look for a moment first in Numbers chapter 12, verse 8. Numbers is the fourth book in the Old Testament. Numbers chapter 12, verse 8. And we can probably clear up this enigma if we look at a few scriptures on the subject. Numbers 12, 8. With him will I speak mouth to mouth, even apparently, and not in dark speeches, and the similitude of the Lord shall he behold. Now, what is a similitude? It's a likeness in some way. Didn't say here he would see the Lord. Now, this is describing Moses' encounter with God. Wherefore then were ye not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? Now, this is what we have here. Moses had a brother and a sister, Aaron and Miriam. And they thought Moses was taking too much authority upon himself. They thought they were just as much leaders as Moses was. After all, he was their younger brother. Both Aaron and Miriam were older than Moses. And they thought that they ought to be as big a leaders as he was. And so they told him that. And God had to put them in their place and say, look, have I talked to you face to face? And have I spoken to you with my mouth like I spoke to Moses? You ought to have been afraid to make such a comment. Now let's look at Deuteronomy 34. Deuteronomy 34, verse 10. And there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Now there's a comment on that statement about Moses seeing God face to face. There's a comment on that in Psalm 99, and it'll clear up the whole problem. Psalm 99. Well, let's see what verse I want here. Here in verse 7. He spoke unto them in the cloudy pillar. They kept his testimony and ordinance that he gave them. Thou answerest them, O Lord, our God. Now, any time that Moses talked to God, so to speak, face to face, God had wrapped himself in this great dark cloud. Now, we find this back in Exodus 33 again. See, in Exodus 33:9, and it came to pass, as Moses entered into the tabernacle, the cloudy pillar descended and stood at the door of the tabernacle, and the Lord talked with Moses. When Moses was up in the mountain and talked with God face to face, and later on, when he talked to God face to face at this temporary tabernacle, actually what happened was the presence of God manifested itself in this great cloudy pillar. And Moses didn't see anything but a black pillar of cloud with a voice of God speaking out of it. God had hidden himself from Moses in this way so that Moses wouldn't be looking directly at his brilliance. And this is what brought about the desire on the part of Moses. He was so to say, now God, you say I'm your friend, but every time you talk to me, you wrap yourself up in a dark cloud with all kind of thunderings and so forth, and you speak to me out of a dark cloud. I want to see you in all your glory. I want to see your glory manifested. The word glory in the Bible means excellence on display. I want to see all of your excellence displayed. Well, God said, no man has ever seen that and lived. You see, the only time man had ever seen God face to face was either in this great pillar of cloud or when he took upon himself human form. Now you find this, for instance, in Genesis chapter 18. He took upon himself human form. And this is a looking forward to Christ. Actually, it was the pre-incarnate Christ appearing to Jacob and appearing to Abraham and appearing to Gideon and appearing to the parents of Samson. It was not God in all of His essence. It was God looking forward to the time when He would be pleased to dwell among us in human flesh, and He momentarily took this flesh upon Him, and He was encased in humanity. And that's the only reason He could be seen. When they looked at God, they saw a human being. Someone that looked just like a fellow human being. God was able to do this. But He could not approach a human being in all of his glory, in all of his brilliance, because man, in his sinful state, cannot behold God in such a manner. Will we ever see God in all of His glory? What will God look like? Many times I'm asked this at Bible classes. People come up to me and they say, now I know we're going to see Jesus just like He is. I know that we're going to be able to see the nail prints in His hands. I know He's going to have a body because the Bible makes that very plain. And I know I'm going to be able to walk up to Him and talk to Him. And I know He's going to look like a fellow human being when I see Him. I understand all of this. But will I see God the Father? Will I know how He looks? Will I be able to look at Him face to face and eyeball to eyeball and speak to Him and shake His hands and so forth? Will I be able to have that type of relationship with God the Father? You know, I want to tell you something interesting. Nobody has ever asked me, nobody ever has asked me if they will be able to see God the Holy Spirit face to face. They never think in terms of whether or not the Holy Spirit might possibly have a bodily form. They just assume He doesn't have. But they want to see God the Father. Now, this has always been true among God's people. And we'll see this in just a moment. And we'll get an answer to that question. Will you see God the Father? Will you see Him face to face? But first, we want to go back here to Moses in Exodus chapter 33 and see just what God did. In verse 18 again. And he, that is Moses, said, I beseech thee, show me thy glory. And God said, I will make all my goodness pass before thee, and I will proclaim the name of the Lord before thee, and will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. And God said, thou shalt not see my face, for there shall no man see me and live. I will put thee in a cleft in the rock, and will cover thee with my hand while I pass by. And I will take away my hand, and thou shalt see my back, but my face shall not be seen. Now, God must have a body, would you say? It talks about Him having a back and having a face and having a hand. Other places, we're told that God has eyes, He has ears, He has nostrils, He has a mouth, He has arms, hands, a breast, legs, feet. All of those terms are used when God is being described. Well, what does it mean? Does He have that type of features? No. Whenever you see it referred to as God having a breast or shoulders, many times He speaks of resting upon His shoulder, or saving you with His arm, or that type of thing. The speech is figurative. We're going to see in a moment that God the Father does not have a physical body. Never has had and never will have. But you say, I want to see Him. How can I see Him if He doesn't have a physical body? Well, we'll get into that. But first I want to see just what happened to Moses here. What God did, He says, Moses, here's a great rock. Now, there are two principal words in the Bible, in the Old Testament, translated rock. And one of them means a great, towering, sheltering rock. It's spelled, English would be T-S-O-O-R, a soar. That's a great, towering rock. And then there's a rock that has a hiding place in it. Or it's like a little cave in a rock that you could find shelter in, and that's called Sela, S-E-L-A. So both of those words are used for rock in your English Bible. And both of them stand for Christ in two different aspects. Now here's what God said to Moses. It says, Moses, I want you to fit down in a little cleft. You see, actually, this word cleft is rock, and the other word rock is rock. So he want to sit you in this little cleft in this great towering rock. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to pass by with my goodness, and just before I get there, I'm going to reach out a hand and put over it so you can't see. And I'm going to leave my hand on that opening on that rock, and I'm going to pass by. And I'm going to keep my hand held over that place in the rock. And then after I'm at some distance from you, I'm going to take my hand away. And then you can look at me departing. Now, when God did that, His glory was so impressive that just that type of an exposure to God caused Moses to glow as though he were effervescent. And this you'll see in chapter 34, verse 29. And it came to pass when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tables of testimony in Moses' hand, when he came down from the mount, that Moses wot not that the skin of his face shone while he talked with him. And it goes on to tell you how he had to put a veil over his face because he just glowed with brilliance. And he'd only seen God as God was departing as His glory. And no human being on this earth has had that much of a glimpse of God but Moses. And Moses didn't die. But no man has seen God face to face in all of His glory as long as man was in his sinful state. Now I said that this rock stands for Christ. You see, the songwriter knew that. Rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in Thee. You see, and then the other one, He hideth my soul in the cleft of the rock and covers me there with His hand. How many of you have heard that song? He hideth my soul. See, it all came from this episode, didn't it? He hideth my soul in the cleft of the rock and covers me there with His hand. Well, you see, the rock of ages cleft for me is Jesus Christ. He is the rock, and He was cleft at Calvary's cross. And therefore, you see, God can have to do with me. And I see the glory of God in the presence of Christ because I'm hidden in the cleft of the rock. Christ is the rock in many other ways. Remember in the 17th chapter, Moses smote the rock and the water came out? Well, Jesus says that was a picture of Him. On Calvary's cross, the rock was smitten and the life-giving water flowed forth. And see, another songwriter caught that. Let the water and the blood from Thy wounded side which flowed be of sin the double cure. Save from wrath and make me pure. The two aspects of cleansing that we receive through the death of Christ. And then He's a rock in many other ways. I've written down here on a little piece of paper the different ways that Christ is called a rock in the Old Testament. He's the smitten rock in Exodus 17:6. He's the cleft rock, Exodus 33:22. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, He is, verse 4, He's the great rock, the perfect rock, the just rock, and the true rock. All in one verse. Deuteronomy 32:4. In Deuteronomy 32:15, He's the rock of salvation. In Deuteronomy 32:18, He's the rock who begot thee. And He's our rock in Deuteronomy 32:31. That whole 32nd chapter of Deuteronomy is a song about the rock. In 2 Samuel 23:3, He's the rock who speaks. And let's leave Exodus now. I don't think we'll be back there. But I want us to turn over to the 61st Psalm. And let's look at a couple of other verses about this rock. Psalm 61. You may recognize the subject for another song here. Psalm 61:1, Hear my cry, O God, attend unto my prayer. From the end of the earth will I cry unto thee when my heart is overwhelmed. Here it is. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I. Now this rock is the T-S-O-O-R rock, the great stone. The picture is this. Here's a wanderer out in the desert. He's in this hot, broiling sun, and he sees a great sheltering rock. If he could only reach that rock, he would be in the shade. He'd be protected from the death-dealing sun rays. And so the thought is, he's overwhelmed in this old world, but there's a rock, and there's a shadow, where he can find rest and where he can find life, because the rock is higher than he is. Now, if the rock were lower than he was, it wouldn't protect him, would it? But the rock is higher than he. Well, Jesus Christ is the rock that is higher than I. Some of you know a song about that, don't you? You ever hear the song about the rock that is higher than I? Just a few of us. But there is such a song. Beautiful song. Now, look in Psalm 62. Verse 2. He only is my rock. And all through here, in Psalm 62, He's my only rock. He's my rock of defense. He's my rock of salvation. He's my the rock of my strength. All of this in the first 7 verses of Psalm 62. Now I want to see this rock one other place in Isaiah chapter 32. Isaiah chapter 32, verse 1, Behold, a king shall reign in righteousness, and princes shall rule in judgment, and a man shall be like a hiding place from the wind, and a covert from the tempest, like rivers of water in a dry place, like the shadow of a great rock in a weary land. Some of you have sung a song about that, A Rock in a Weary Land, haven't you? Anybody know that song? See? We've got some others. So He's a rock in the weary land. They're all about Christ, aren't they? It's in the Old Testament. But He's the rock in a weary land. He's the rock that is higher than I. He's the rock of my strength. He's the cleft in the rock. And by the way, the rock that is higher than I is the T-S-O-O-R rock. The rock in the weary land is the S-E-L-A rock. I just can't miss this. Look back again in Deuteronomy 32, and you'll get the picture that we're talking about. See, in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 4, He is the rock, His work is perfect, all of His ways are judgment, a God of truth, without iniquity, just and right. Now look down in verse 13. We're in Deuteronomy 32:13. He made him ride on the high places of the earth, that he might eat the increase of the fields. He made him to suck honey out of the rock, S-E-L-A rock, and oil out of the flinty rock, T-S-O-O-R rock. Rock twice there. When it speaks of the sweet communion and the sweetness of the honey, it's that gentle hiding place, the little covert in the rock. But when it's speaking of the oil out of the rock, see, oil in the Bible stands for the empowering of God. And this is the great rock, the sheltering rock. So sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other, but it's always still the rock. So Jesus is that rock. Now I think I've told you this story before, but I want to tell it again. How many of you remember me telling you the story of the girl in Groveland that wrote the poem about the rock? How many of you remember that? Okay, I want to tell it to you again. Several years ago, there was a lay witness mission. A group of laymen came and witnessed at the Methodist Church in Groveland. And during that weekend, a girl was saved. I think at that time she was a junior or a senior in high school. I think a junior in high school. And she had a mother and a father, and she had a sister named Hazel. And the last name was Langenbach. Well, this young lady became very interested in the things of the Lord. She was saved during that weekend. She became very interested in things of the Lord. And she would go out on these witnessing missions. And her sister had moved to Orlando and taken a job there and got a long way, as I understand it, from the things of the Lord. Our young lady was detected that her mother was probably saved, but her father wasn't. But her father came to Christ at one of our Bible studies up in Groveland back in the early days, 5 or 6 years ago now, and he really just went all out for the Lord right from the beginning. And well, I had forgotten the girl's name for a moment, but her name was Ellen. Now I remember it. So Ellen and her mother and her daddy began to really grow in the Lord. And they began to pray for their sister Hazel, who was far, far from the Lord and who was living in Orlando. Hazel was older than Ellen. And so one day, Ellen heard that Jack Wurtson and the Word of Life team was coming to Orlando for a youth conference, and she got Hazel to go with her to it. And Ellen didn't see any visible results in the meeting, but the next day, Hazel called Ellen on the phone and said that night, after she'd gone home, she'd invited the Lord to come into her heart. Well, right from the very beginning, Hazel began to really enjoy the things of the Lord. And I remember the first time, just after she was saved a few days, she came to one of the Bible studies. And her problem right then was that she loved the young man very much, and she realized he didn't know the Lord. And somehow the Spirit of God let her know that she wasn't supposed to get married to him if he weren't a Christian. But he got put in the hospital a few weeks later, and while he was there in the hospital, she led him to Christ. And then she married him. And they're still married. This is 5 or 6 years ago. But on May the 14th, 1970, just after Hazel had come to Christ, she came over to Groveland to one of our Bible studies, and we had a Bible study that night on the rock, Jesus Christ the rock. And I noticed that her eyes were watery several times during the Bible lesson. And so she went home and she wrote this poem. Now, a brand new Christian, and as far as I know, this was the first real Bible study she'd been to since she'd been saved. And it was on the rock. And I have the copy of it. It says HCL, that's Hazel C. Langenbach, May 14th, 1970. And here it is. She says, I was stumbling along with the rest of the crowd through the desolate desert of life. Our souls were parched, eyes blinded, minds dulled. Hate and confusion were rife. I strayed from the group to search for some shade, just a small space to lie down and die. And on the horizon there appeared a large rock, a rock that was higher than I. It was solid and smooth except for a cleft, which looked long enough and wide, so that if I could reach there, it would be a close fit, but I thought I might get inside. Then the sunlight struck the cleft in the rock, and I uttered a low moaning sound. For the sparkling reflections could mean but one thing. There was water trickling down. I was too weak to walk, so I cried out in grief and dropped to the sand on one knee. Then I raised my eyes for a last glance around, and the rock was standing by me. I lifted my hands to the cleft in the rock, and the water flowed out like blood. I felt peace and strength filling my soul, and I knelt and washed in the flood. Then the flow was staunched, and I crawled inside. I'm sure now that heaven smiled, for the rock closed round me as a father's arms closed round his sleeping child. Isn't that a wonderful testimony of confidence in the rock? Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you for a rock that is higher, a sheltering rock. We thank you, God, for the cleft in the rock, the hiding place that we have because this great rock this great strong rock, this great sheltering rock, was pleased to be cleft, that we might have a hiding place. And we thank you now for the sweet honey that flows. We thank you for God, for the oil, the anointing oil that empowers us to go forth, no matter what the winds of the desert might be. And we thank you for this great truth that we have a rock. He's our rock. And He's higher than we are. He's a shelter in a weary land. And out from Him flows the life-giving water. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.